in our present moment, when we're so divided in the United States, especially in Christianity, I think it helps us not to see everybody as villains, but to see us as victims of a collective era.
Welcome to another episode of Holy Heretics, Losing Religion and Finding Jesus from the Sophia Society. We're your hosts, Melanie
and Gary Allen.
Before we get started, we just wanted to say a big thanks to our Patreon supporters. Your support really means the world to us, and it does help us keep creating great content. If you are listening and are interested in contributing to our work, you can find more information about that by going to patreon.com/holyheretics. Now, today, we have the privilege of sitting down with Chris Staron, the producer of Truce Podcast. Chris is the award-winning filmmaker behind Bringing Up Bobby and Between the Walls. He's also the author of the dramatic Christian thriller Cradle Robber. His heart, ultimately, though, is for people who are on the outside edges of popular Christianity, so the underrepresented, the skeptics, and those who have been hurt by the church. His podcast, then, is a vehicle to express the unmet needs of the outsiders. When he's not juggling multiple episodes at the same time, Chris enjoys hiking, cross-country skiing, improv comedy, and teaching Sunday school. So welcome, Chris. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, Chris, so tell us a little bit about your podcast, Truce, and maybe just why you started it.
Sure. Yeah. The show comes out every 2 weeks, and it's a show that looks inside the American Christian church, generally to figure out how we got here and how we can do better. So for the last year and a half or so, I've been talking about how the rise of communism in Russia impacted the American Christian church. And you see it all over the place if you're looking for it. It just comes up all the time. So that's what I've been covering in season 3. And I started the show 3 years ago, three and a half years ago, because I started to see there was all this tension amongst my friends and family who had all sorts of different ideas about Christianity and the government and political beliefs, and everybody was angry and everybody was tense and upset. And I was like, well, why is this? And one of my theories is that a lot of times we just don't understand our history and why the thing we're fighting about is the way it is. And so just in researching things from my friends, when they would bring something up, it would be like, oh, I guess, we really don't understand this particular issue. And so the show was a way for me to bring some of that research out and disseminate it. And now it's just become this project of joy for me that I really love doing. And I don't think I could stop if I wanted to.
Just because you're learning so much, or why is that?
Yeah, every time it's one of those deals where it's like I pull up one rock and there's 2 rocks underneath it. Like every time I uncover one thing, there's like a bunch of bunny trails underneath it that I had to explore, which is really exciting for a podcaster, because I initially started thinking I was going to run out of material in a couple of months, and I've got a whole year planned out from this point.
Oh, wow.
Ahead of where I am now. I don't have it all researched or figured out, but just what I want to talk about. And it's actually very exciting for me to have that opportunity. But I'm hoping that through doing this, I can create an avenue for folks to better understand how we got to where we are. Because I think that if we understand how we got to where we are, we can make better decisions and hopefully be more compassionate towards each other.
Yeah, I think that's really fascinating, because like thinking back in my own Christian upbringing, there wasn't much talk of like what was Christianity like in the decades preceding when I was growing up, let alone centuries preceding where we were in that point in history. And as an adult, I've learned a lot more about it, but there's still so much more to learn. So I think it's really interesting that like once you bring up that idea of like, how did we get here? It's like, oh yeah, how did we get here? But you don't really think about that just on your own, just as a Christian going through life. You don't think about like what influenced the faith that I've been taught. And so you brought up talking about how Russian communism has impacted American Christianity. how did you even discover that influence, or how did you realize like this is actually really impacted the faith that we have today?
Yeah, I was working on season 2, which was a grab bag of episodes, which season 1 was as well. And it just kept coming up. I kept seeing, this was a reaction to communism, or, especially if you get into like the moral majority stuff. I kind of wanted to do something about Jerry Falwell, and I still haven't really done it yet. And honestly, it's going to be years until I can get there, because I kept realizing if I wanted to explain Jerry Falwell and the moral majority, I really had to explain everything that came before him. So as not to just, it'd be easy enough to just demonize him. But if you understand what came before him, you can kind of see the logic that came into it. It may be faulty logic, but there's still logic there. And so I think that in order to understand and have compassion for our brothers and sisters, you have to go further back. So that was what got me started. It was like, well, I've enjoyed history. I'm not a historian myself. I'm sort of an armchair historian. I just read whatever I want, whatever I'm interested in. And I didn't even know why the Russian Revolution happened when I initially started this thing. So the beginning of season 3, I had to start from scratch, like basically zero. I couldn't have told you like what century the revolution happened in. So
I have to be honest, I don't think I even learned about the Russian Revolution in school. So
right.
I didn't even know it existed.
It was a huge
everyone
deal.
dies. That's the plot line. Everyone
kind
dies.
of, yes. Kind of, yes. And even the parts that I knew about the Russian Revolution, it was basically that everybody dies, but I didn't know what brought it on. And once I started at that, I realized that there were a lot of parallels between what was going on before the Russian Revolution and what was going on in the United States at the time, with workers' rights and people coming to the cities from rural areas, being mistreated, children working in factories, long hours, low pay, dirty conditions, dangerous conditions. Those things were happening parallel to each other in the United States and in Russia. So it was just like really fascinating to me how we dealt with these things in 2 very different ways. They had a revolution that was supposed to, bring peace and calm and tranquility to Russia, and it didn't. And we had union troubles and then union busting. And so it's kind of its own messy thing in the United States, just not quite as brutal. So I find that stuff to be fascinating when you can have 2 parallel stories going at the same time. And so I thought it was really important to tell the story of the Russian Revolution because folks like myself, I didn't know what it was about. So it was easy to assume nobody else did, or a few other people did. And hopefully that gives, like I said, compassion to us to understand that it didn't just happen out of nowhere. It happened for a whole bunch of reasons. And so you can see what came after it as sort of a logical progression. Again, bad logic, but a logical progression of the stuff that came before it.
Well, I am old enough to remember the Reagan years and old enough to remember the rise of the moral majority, and in particular how Christianity in America became tied to capitalism, and how the big bad red Russians were the communists and they were anti-God and God haters. And so we were fighting a ideological and theological war with, throughout the Cold War. And it's interesting that I actually uncovered, you may have seen this too, Chris, some old campaign photos from Ronald Reagan, who literally said at one point to a huge evangelical audience, we want to make America great again. And
that's not a new phrase.
It's not new at all. And that was shocking to me. So, yeah, by the way, have you watched the television show? I know it's a few years old, but The Americans?
I have not. No.
Okay, it's it's a little bit dark, it's a little bit twisty, but you might enjoy it specifically as it relates to this entire story of communism and the fear of communism. It doesn't necessarily get into the role of the church, but it definitely shapes and shows us the ethos of what it meant to be an American, in the 80s and early 90s. Pretty fascinating. So
Yeah.
so it sounds like you have taken a deep dive, not only into church history but also American history. What would you say is the most surprising thing you've learned in some of your research?
Yeah, I was really fascinated by how many of our monuments to sort of a Christian America are pretty new. And so there's a whole bunch of episodes that I did about, say, monuments to the Ten Commandments or the National Prayer Breakfast, God being on the money, God being in the Pledge of Allegiance, all those things. I wanted to find out how he got there into each of those things. And it turns out they basically all happened in the 1950s, at just within the span of a couple of years. And in conversations I was having with friends and people that I met about, is the United States a Christian nation, inevitably those things would come up. And it's like, well, really, for 70% of our history, those things weren't there.
Mm.
they're fairly new. And I thought that was really interesting. We have such a short memory. We kind of assume that the way things are now is the way it's always been. And the things that we have now are the things we've always had. So it's funny, even you talk to a teenager now, and YouTube has always been there for them. They don't know a time before YouTube, but I do. And I remember even when it came out thinking, nobody's going to look at this. Why would anybody want to see somebody's home videos? Yeah. I was way off. But, it seems like there's always been that time for these young people, that YouTube has always been there. The internet's always been there. But that's not the case. And it's not the case for American monuments to like the Ten Commandments. They haven't always been there. And we just kind of get used to that idea. And it becomes a part of our heritage, even, something that's not that old. And then once it becomes part of our heritage, it's really hard to separate from our faith, because everything gets tied together, which is, it's okay. It's kind of a natural part of the world, and I don't want to say that the people who do that are evil. It's just a natural part of how we survive in this world, is to try to create an idea of our heritage. But if that heritage happens to be incorrect and one of those pieces falls out, it could collapse the whole deal. So if you tie your faith to a whole bunch of things that really are not reliable, there's a chance that you could lose your faith or have to ask some really big questions.
I want to jump in on that because I think you're onto something. So many of us grew up tying our faith with America, and in so many hearts and minds, they are one. And to question one is to really question the other one, as we have said earlier. And it's really fascinating when you ask people that question. Do you think America is a Christian nation? And I would say that the majority of white evangelicals would say resoundingly yes. And my question to them as a historian has always been, when was this mythical time? When was America Christian? Was it when the first slave ships arrived in 1619? Was it during the genocide of Native Americans? Was it during segregation and the Civil War? And I understand that, there are some beautiful founding principles that were based on Christian principles. But when we began to look really intently at our history, it's pretty sordid. It's pretty violent, and it's pretty racist. And there's so many eras of American history that look nothing like Jesus. And I think it's beautiful what you're doing is really helping people disentangle these two ideas. Really begin to separate. Hey, we don't have to hate America. We're not doing that, but we do need to take a long, hard look at how we have co-joined these two myths and co-joined these two stories. And it's probably not helpful for any of us.
Yeah. When it's like you said, I don't, my goal is not to make anybody hate America.
Right.
Actually, I'm really thankful to live in the United States. But I think it's healthy for us to have a 3D view of what the United States really is, the good and the bad, the ups and the downs. So I did a story about the American coup in Guatemala that we did. I want to say it was in the 1950s. We there was a United Fruit Company that grew bananas down in Guatemala, and there was an American company, and there was a democratically elected leader named Arbenz was his last name, and he came in and was hoping to take some of the land that United Fruit was not using and give it to some of the peasants so that they could build a better life for themselves. And they were going to pay for it, and United Fruit wasn't using it. It was just laying fallow. But United Fruit decided that they were going to make a big deal out of this. And they painted Arbenz as a communist, and he wasn't. And this is, right at the heart of the Cold War. So calling somebody a communist was a big deal. Mm-hmm. And they were able to, through media and through connections at the CIA, to oust President Arbenz, again, a democratically elected leader. And they were able to put in somebody who was friendlier to American business, even though not a democratically elected leader. So it's a fascinating story. And we've done that a whole bunch of times. That is not the only time we've done it. We did it a whole bunch of times. And if you start thinking about that is a part of American history, just as much as, any kind of really positive thing you could think of, say the national parks. It's the same. It's also a part of our history. And if we're not incorporating that into our understanding of the country, we're gonna really struggle to have a good view of the country. You hear it around even discussions of World War II, which is like the war that everybody likes to talk about and read about. It's like the socially acceptable war in the United States. Every book is about it. It's amazing. Even like romance books are about World War II now. And we tend to believe that the United States won World War II, when really, if you look at the numbers and the sacrifices, Russia had a huge impact that far outweighed our contribution. Not that we were insignificant, but Russia lost way more people than we did, and had their own land invaded, where we were safe on the other side of the world, for the most part. And it's that kind of disconnect. We don't often think of other countries. We only think of the United States as being exceptional. Right. And it is a fantastic country to be from. But if you don't have a 3D view of things, history is going to be very difficult for you. and really understanding other people is going to be very difficult for you, especially from other cultures. Even down to being a missionary, if you're a missionary and you go to Guatemala and you're like, oh, these people are so poor. If only they worked harder. It's like, well, they had a democratically elected leader in the 50s that we overthrew, and their country wouldn't be in such bad shape if we didn't do this to them. Right. So even down to our missions can be impacted by the United States and by our reactions to these folks and to communism. So I think it's really important that we understand it especially again for our missions and how we're going to react to other countries that may be in the position they're in because of something that we did.
Well, I think it's really important to tell those stories. Most of us grew up telling the story of American exceptionalism. And when we uncover these darker stories that, we really don't like to tell about ourselves, it can be pretty disenchanting. I mean, I think of the secret war in Laos, where the United States dropped more bombs per capita on that country than in the history of the world, and the damage still done to those people, and it can be discouraging as an American to take a long hard look at our checkered past, but we do ourselves a disservice when we gloss over those, kind of the dirty parts of our city on a hill. We have to come to terms with those, especially as Christians who really believe that we are a part of a kingdom that transcends the United States. So I just applaud what you're doing.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that is the beauty of what you're doing is you're helping people to not have that black and white, us versus them thinking. You're saying like, it's not okay to just believe that there's these perfect good guys and these evil to the core bad guys. You're helping people see like everything's connected, and there are reasons why people do what they do. And it's not just so simple as like, well, Americans are the good guys, and so no matter what we do, it's going to be good. You're saying like, no, we actually can do some pretty terrible things.
Yeah.
In the name of God, a lot of times as well.
Yeah. And I mean, it's really hard to understand. And I also don't want to say that there isn't evil in the world. But a lot of the times when we paint somebody else, especially a whole group of people as evil, it's easier for us to do that than to realize that they are sinners who need Jesus just as much as I do. It can be kind of a dehumanizing mentality that we have. And we do with all sorts of different things, and we all have sort of what I call those people, if it weren't for those people, this country would be great. And it could be, anything. We're kind of all over the place in creating those people. But that means that a lot of the times that gives me an excuse to not have to reach out, not to have compassion. When again, like you said, we are part of a kingdom, and the kingdom is greater than the United States. Our mission is to be reaching out with the kingdom of God. And it's a hard and tricky thing to do in a modern world, but that's what we're called to do. And I think a lot of us are in a place where maybe our loved ones are on the other side of a battle, and we don't understand how they can believe whatever it is they believe. And it's so easy to lose compassion for those people and think that they're crazy and write them off. But that doesn't do anybody any good, especially in our present moment when we're so divided in the United States, especially in Christianity. I think it helps us not to see everybody as villains, but to see us as victims of a collective era where our media has not done a great job. I don't care what organization you get your media from, they have not done a great job with this era. Our politicians have let us down. The churches are put in a lot of really difficult places right now. It's a difficult time to be alive. And so I think that we have all sort of been victims of that era. So hopefully if you can see that, maybe, your parents who have a different view of you, or your family or coworkers, if you can have compassion that they're the victim of the same era that you are, they're just dealing with it in a different way. Hopefully that can give you some compassion. That's what I'm working on in my own life, to avoid the villain mentality.
I think we all need to work on that in our own lives. I'm curious how you would say your faith or your perception of Christianity has changed as a result of everything that you've learned.
Yeah, I hope it's made me more compassionate. It's like I said with the villain thing. I am tempted to see other people as villains all the time, and hopefully it's made me more compassionate, but also hopefully less fearful, because I think one of the worst words that we've used in this era has been unprecedented. And because that causes people to have fear that the era they're living in there's no history for this. This could not have been seen coming. And there's never been an era that has been like this. When in reality, we live in a very cyclical world, where, you look at the kind of journalism that we have now and the problems that we have. You go back to the days of William Randolph Hearst, and you would have seen exactly the same thing. Where newspapers were divided based on political parties. That's been a thing for a long time. Napoleon Bonaparte did that. He would insert stuff in the media and cause people to believe one thing that was completely untrue, but it was just he could get it in the media, and so like he didn't have an independent media of his era, and so that is not unprecedented. Sickness and disease, totally not unprecedented. We can ignore them because a lot of the times the diseases that go on are happening in other countries. We didn't have to deal with SARS in the way that other countries did. But they happened. That doesn't mean they're unprecedented. They just didn't happen here. Or you look at even something like AIDS, which is happening here, but it's easy enough for us to ignore if we aren't it's not a part of our community, even though it is an epidemic. So that unprecedented thing is is really unhelpful.
Right.
There's a tremendous amount of precedent for everything we're going through. And I think studying these things has really given me a lot of hope that the Christian church has come through a lot worse than this. Where you look at the things that happened shortly after the Reformation, and the things that the church went through with literal wars and people dying over denominational differences. We're in a pretty good place, and I think that gives me a lot of hope. Compared to those eras, that we can come out of this. But it's gonna take the church learning how to be the church again.
Mm-hmm. Well, it feels like it's going to take the church learning what the truth is again. As you were talking about Napoleon and propaganda, it reminded me of a quote attributed to Adolf Hitler, and he said, "If you tell a big enough lie and tell it frequently enough, it will be believed." And we've seen so many lies thrown out there, and then we just buy it because our allegiance is to a political party and not necessarily, to the truth. And as you said, it's really difficult to have compassion for our family and our friends who in some ways have been the victims of lies and been the victims of propaganda. So how have you created and even fostered compassion for those individuals in your sphere of influence and in your life who maybe have bought some of the lies of the political jargon that's going on and or have been the victims of marginalization?
Yeah, I should say I'm not an expert in that because I struggle a lot in that area. But my goals for myself include being a better listener than a talker. If I can try to listen more and ask good questions, I find that I'll help people say things that they haven't said out loud, and maybe that'll help them figure out, oh, maybe that doesn't work. Maybe I don't like how that sounds when it comes out of my mouth. Or else trying to be incremental about change that I'm encouraging. So I have a loved one who sends me conspiracy emails, and
I think we all have that person in our lives.
Do you? And some of it comes down to just good internet etiquette, where it's you can't just send a forward to me with an attachment because that's how viruses are spread on the internet. Just trying to educate even in those little things. Media literacy is really lacking. So media literacy is a really good way to talk about things. Sure, you got this article, but what is the source? Where are they getting this information from? Is kind of a helpful way to go about it. But really the listening thing is really key to me for compassion, because I can start to understand the fears that people have. And if I can understand where that fear is coming from, I can better figure out how to deal with it. One of the things that my brother and I have been working on, I have a twin brother and we live together. We made the movies together and stuff. So we're very close, and I run a lot of the ideas of the podcast by him. But he and I have been trying to realize more that the thing that people are presenting to us is rarely their issue. It's usually something behind that. And if you can get to that thing that's behind the upfront issue, you can generally solve the problem much better. It's like if you're having an argument with somebody that you love, and honestly, we argue the hardest with the people that we love the most, right? If you're having an argument with them, frequently that argument is about something else. Somebody didn't do the dishes, but really they're upset that you forgot their birthday, something like that. So it's the same in other realms of our lives. Oftentimes that thing somebody's holding on to that they're presenting publicly is not the main issue. There's usually something else behind it. So if the goal is to always get to that thing that's behind it and to understand that.
Well, I love that. I think that's really needed in our day and age, is kind of putting yourself in their shoes and understanding where they're coming from, because it's so easy to just label them and then say now I understand everything about them, but that's never the case. So one question I wanted to ask you is, it has to do with the name of this podcast. So it's called Holy Heretics, and we called it that for a lot of reasons, but one of the main reasons that we did that is because we and our listeners and even guests like you have either felt shunned from the church or from people within the church, or even actually been called names like heretic or apostate or Jezebel if they're women. So I would assume, based on everything you've told us, that you have probably been labeled some things like that as well, or at least had people kind of give you that vibe of like, well, I'm concerned about you, like you're going off the deep end kind of thing. So what would you say is the biggest belief or posture that you hold that you feel like might lead someone who's not on the margins to write you off or to call you a heretic?
Oh, yeah. So the main thing, especially with season 3, has been I've been trying to treat different viewpoints with respect. So the main thing I get called, and it's not very often, is socialist, and I'm not a socialist, but it's an easy understanding it's an easy word to slap on stuff, and it's an easy way for people to disregard you. But in some circles, to even question just pure market capitalism is seen as an attack on Christianity. And you can hear that. I mean, it's put out on the radio and in the media all the time, as Christian media all the time, that, market capitalism is God's design. I actually had a press release sent to me from somebody trying to push that the Old Testament, like, flat out lays out capitalism. And I was like, I read the verses they were putting out there, and I'm like, that is not what that verse is about at all.
Oh gosh.
And but you see that, that stuff comes up. We're just really afraid, we're really afraid to say that, capitalism is great, but it should be regulated. And it should be regulated appropriately. Not to choke things, but that's my stance. It's like, I'm a capitalist, but I think it should be regulated appropriately. And so it's much easier for folks to worry that I'm a socialist. And so if you look on Apple Podcasts, there are some comments that'll say that. And I did have my church that I go to. I love my local church. But we are a very spiritually diverse church, although maybe not culturally diverse, because I don't live in a particularly culturally diverse town. But a very spiritually diverse town where we've got ex-Mormons, we've got ex-Mormons, we've got Catholics, Baptists, Methodists. I mean, really everything, Pentecostals. So this is it's the church where everybody ends up when they don't have anywhere else to go, which is kind of what I love about my church. But it does mean that folks are going to disagree from time to time. And I think that's actually healthy. But I approached the missions board about a year ago to see if they would consider financing the show. And the head of the missions board, who is a guy I have a ton of respect for, does not like my show because he believes that the founding fathers were all Christians and this is a Christian nation. And respectfully disagreed with me. But it did mean I didn't get any funding, and I'm still, driving a school bus for a living to try to make ends meet, which is, that's how it goes. I produced all the movies while working other jobs. I wrote the books while working other jobs. So this is just kind of how it's always been. But I've actually been kind of blessed because the show is sort of small, that I haven't had too much fallout about it. I'm just now starting to get some spam attacks on the website. I don't know if that's directed at the show or it's just like some bot that's terrorizing the internet. But otherwise, I've been pretty blessed. I do know there are folks who think I'm a socialist. Doesn't matter how many times I say I'm not. That's okay. It's the price you pay sometimes for trying to encourage people to think. It's easier for them to label you than to question their own assumptions. But I
think that's really telling too, that's like, it wasn't like, oh, well, I have this view of the Bible or I have this view of sin, or it wasn't a theological issue. I think it's telling that like it's socialism versus capitalism, that it like shows how tied our politics are in the US to Christianity. So I think that's just fascinating.
Yeah, and I work really hard to keep the show sort of theologically orthodox. I don't want to ever try to push people in a weird, I don't want to get off into weird esoteric stuff. because I think that shuts folks down. And also, I don't believe any weird esoteric stuff. So I want to keep it as theologically orthodox as possible. And a lot of the conversations that folks hear about these kinds of things are from folks who are kind of out there theologically. And I think that to have a show that is trying to be theologically orthodox, question these things is a very weird thing in the market. And so I don't blame them for wanting to label me as a socialist or as nuts, because that's what they usually hear, or that's what they're usually encountering when they hear stuff like this. So I just have to be compassionate and understand that folks are going to draw those conclusions.
Yeah.
Especially like, go ahead.
Well, and you can maybe point them to Acts 2 and the early church, which we could be so bold as to say that they were far more than just socialist in their practices. You know, I mean, they lived in community. Yeah. You know, and we can't even compare that, you know, to modern socialism or modern communism. But what a beautiful representation of maybe a different way of treating economics and property that we see in the early church, you know, which was pretty revolutionary.
Yeah, it's a weird thing because Acts 2 is not socialism in general. If you're going for like a broad definition, is when the government owns the means of production but gives the people the profit. So the weird thing about Acts 2 is that it is not a government running things.
Exactly.
And it was a voluntary giving up of things. So like you get into the story of Ananias and Sapphira, their sin was not that they didn't give everything to the people. The problem is that they lied about what they gave. It was a lie. So it was not an enforced socialism like would actually fit. Acts 2 is sort of a beast of its own, where it's really the church being the church and not a government organization stepping it up. So it's a weird thing because it's funny because everybody, like, depending on what side you're on, you want to see socialism in there or you want to see capitalism in there, and neither are actually endorsed in the Bible. Neither are laid out.
Neither one of them fit, do they? Because it's an invitation.
Neither of them do.
Yeah, it's an invitation to give freely, and boy, that calls into question both systems, you know.
Yeah, I mean, the early church in Acts, they're under the Roman Empire. They have basically no power whatsoever, which is something that is like totally foreign for us in the United States. And, you know, Paul writes these letters telling them to obey their leaders. It's something that we can't deal with in our heads. Like we can't wrap around. In some ways, I kind of think it was much easier for them to obey their leaders because they weren't. The hard thing for us is we're electing our leaders. And so in a way, I am a leader of this country, and like those, you know, the president and the vice president, all those folks are getting their power from me. And so it's a weird setup that I think it's hard to suss out when reading the Bible, because democracy is not really in the Bible like that.
Right.
And so we're just in a funny place. We got to suss it out. We got to be delicate and take the Bible as a whole instead of in pieces, the parts that we like. And that's really tricky to do because the Bible is a gigantic book and most of us Christians haven't read it. And so it's tough because people will make big stands based on one verse that their pastor preached on, but they don't actually have the whole of the Bible in their mind. So it's a weird thing. We there's a lot of juggling that has to go on and a lot of compassion and grace that has to go on all sides. Because it is easy to pull socialism out of there. It's easy to pull capitalism out of there, but truly the Bible doesn't endorse either.
Hey, you mentioned this a few minutes ago, the word hope. And I'm curious, when you look at the future of faith, in particular in maybe North America, what gives you hope?
Yeah. You know, I have an episode coming out, a little mini episode at the end of season 3. I interviewed Dr. Richard Land, who is sort of a Republican mouthpiece in the Christian world. So he goes to these big conferences like National Religious Broadcasters Convention, and he has radio shows and podcasts and those things. Very, very conservative guy. And I didn't know who he was when I interviewed him, but we got off and he was giving me basically the Republican party line all the way down. I couldn't get him to go different from it. I couldn't get him to elaborate on stuff. And it's actually kind of some painful tape. I was really like unsure if I wanted to make this episode because it's painful to listen to, me trying to struggle against it, all this stuff. And after we shut down the recorder, and this is like where I broke the laws of journalism, you should always be recording. He said to me that the problem with your generation, talking to me, problem with my generation is that we are unwilling to see things as black and white, good and evil. And I spent a lot of time thinking about that, because I do think it's appropriate to see things as good and evil, black and white, when they are good and evil and black and white. But one of the things that gives me hope is that I think that this generation is starting to learn that a lot of these things that we have labeled black and white are not quite black and white, or they're complex, and complexity can't be dealt with well in black and white situations. Complexity has to be dealt with in a complex way. That's the best way to see things, and I think that's what this younger generation is bringing to the table, as we're starting to consider. Oh, you know what? Maybe African Americans have been harassed by the police, for a long time. That yes, I understand that it is possible to both support the police and support African Americans. I think that this generation is being asked to do some very complicated things. Oh, maybe women have actually been sexually harassed in like every industry since time immemorial. Maybe it's time to actually think about that. And I think that some of these movements that are coming out are really forcing younger generations to question those things. And as long as we can understand that the Bible is not against any of those things, it is actually for us treating women and foreigners and African Americans, people of different races, with compassion and with generosity, I think we've got a place. I think there's a lot of hope for Christianity in that. So I'm actually pretty excited about this younger generation coming up, that hopefully they will be able to correct some of these wrongs by thinking in a complex way.
Love that. Okay, we have one last thing for you.
Yeah.
We just want to ask you some fun rapid fire questions. So we're just going to ask them and you answer as quickly as you can without thinking.
Sure.
So does that sound okay?
Yeah, I'm an improv comedian. I'm used to not thinking.
All right, perfect. All right. In your bio, you mentioned that you like both hiking and cross-country skiing. So if you had to choose between summer and winter, which would you pick and why?
Oh, summer for sure. But I live in Western Wyoming, and it is strikingly beautiful here. And I love getting places on my own power. So hiking, you would not believe some of the places we can get to out here, and there'll be like nobody else for 10 miles. And it's just like an incredible thing to be out there.
And there's mountain lions, which is kind of scary, right?
And there's mountain lions. Yeah. You're much more likely to be gored by a moose than you are to be attacked by a mountain lion.
Okay.
That's an image.
That's encouraging. That's really encouraging.
Yeah. Let me give you a new thing to be afraid of.
Okay. So you mentioned you're into improv comedy. Can you give us a little taste? Like, give us your best joke.
Oh, improv is actually, it's funny enough, it's not about jokes. It's about scene work, and about listening to your partner, and oftentimes not trying to be funny. And so I could tell you a joke, but that wouldn't be the same as improv. So I think if an improv comedian heard me tell a joke and not clarify, they'd be very upset.
Yeah. We don't want that.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I think that one of my favorite jokes is it's got a little pot of humor, and I'm okay with that. If you're okay with that,
we're okay.
It's not gross, but there's 3 old men sitting around, and they're talking about the good old days. And the one guy says, back when I was young, I used to be able to pee like this really strong stream, and it was just beautiful. I can't pee anymore. I says, no. And the second guy's like, I used to get up and I would go to, I'm taking number 2 every single day at the same time, like clockwork. And now I just struggle with that. And then the third guy's like, well, I every morning at 6 o'clock on the dime, I take a number 2 and I take a number 1, and it's strong, just like when I was young. And the other 2 guys are like, well, then what are you upset about? You go regularly every day at 6. And the guy says, well, yeah, I go every day at 6, but I don't get up until 9.
Oh. Oh. Yeah, that's a problem.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm okay with a little bit of potty humor. I just did.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, who is the most interesting person you've ever met or interviewed?
Oh, the most interesting person I've ever met or interviewed. I have a friend
Besides
here
us.
who, besides you, yes, I have a friend here who's not famous in any way. He is the local guy who set up the internet for our valley. He works for a communications company here. And I've gone on a few hikes with him, and he is endlessly fascinating to me. And he's just some guy. He's my age. He's just a fascinating dude. Like I am always interested. He's always got some crazy story about something that happened in some canyon or some bit of local history or some vacation he went on, or he'll tell me about how he brings internet to this valley. And it's all fascinating. And for some reason, we only hang out once a year.
Yeah.
But I treasure it every single time.
All right. So what's the coolest hike you've ever done?
Yeah, I did a hike in Iceland. There was a 4-day hike. I want to say it's the Landmannalaugar Trail. I always mess up what it is. Or I can't remember if it's the town of Landmannalaugar or it's the trail. It's called that. But anyway, if you look it up in a map, you end up hiking through multiple different zones. And like one day is basically steam coming up from the ground. So it looks like you're on Mars. And really sparse, not a lot of vegetation or anything. Another day is hills. Another day, the third day is like this big flat, like super, super flat expanse with all these black rocks on either side. And somebody cleared a straight path down it. And mountains on either side. And then the last day, you're going up and over that volcano that went off at like 2008. Do you remember there was a volcano that shut down?
Yeah.
I went up and over that and stayed at the top.
Wow.
With some people that I met on the trail. It's just an incredible, incredible hike. Really much easier than you would think for that many miles. But it was incredible, really beautiful.
Well, I've always wanted to go to Iceland. So now you need to go even more.
If you go, definitely do a hike because it's one of those things that the seaside is beautiful, but it's a lot like Maine. So you could save a lot of money and just go to Maine. But if you go, you really need to go on a hike.
Well, my husband's a rock climber and ice climber and all that, so there's no way we wouldn't.
Okay.
If we just sat there, he would be very unhappy. So which this kind of relates because nobody can go anywhere right now because of COVID. So this is the last question. What's something that you can't do now because of COVID that you can't wait to get back to doing?
Oh yeah, actually it's improv comedy. Our troupe has been together for something like 11 years. And a lot of the same people have been in it for most of that time. And it's just an incredible thing because, we would get together every Tuesday and rehearse. And when it's rehearsal, we can just get together and tell each other about the week. And then a lot of the times we would incorporate what happened in our friend's week into the scenes, which is kind of like a therapeutic way to process things and then be able to laugh. And we have, hundreds of inside jokes together. And they're just the best group of people who you get the sense that they would do anything for you if you needed them to. And so I really, really miss them. And it'd be fun to get back in front of an audience because I think I've gotten weirder over COVID because
I think we all have.
I don't have the outlet, and my podcast is so serious for the most part. I don't have the outlet. So I'm really looking forward to that.
Yeah, we've all gotten weirder and a little bit fatter, but that's
COVID
life.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Oh, hey, Chris, this has really been fun.
Good.
As well as enlightening. So for all of us who are interested in you and your podcast, where can you direct us to get more information and to hear your voice more?
Sure. Yeah. You can hear Truce anywhere you get podcasts or at trucepodcast.com. And while you're there, you can also find links to my novel Cradle Robber and to my movies Bringing Up Bobby and Between the Walls. And actually, Bringing Up Bobby just was legally put on YouTube for the first time a few weeks ago. So if you want to see it, ours is the one with nobody famous in it. There's another one that was made a few years later with the same name. Ours is the one with nobody famous. So yeah.
Well, you can tell you're a podcaster and that you've said that a few times. That was good. Very, very polished.
Thank you very much.
And we'll make sure to link to all of that in the show notes as well for anyone who would rather just go there. We'll make sure all that info is in there for you as well. So thank you so much for joining us today, Chris.
Thanks for having me.
Really great.
Yep.
My pleasure.
Thanks for listening today. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss an episode. We have lots of great interviews coming up that you definitely won't want to miss. As always, you can find show notes as well as all our social media info at holyheretics.org. And finally, just in case you missed it, we have a brand new ebook called Faith Deconstruction 101 that's all about helping you on your deconstruction journey and perhaps reconstruction if that's something that you want to do. You can download that for free by going to sophiasociety.org/ebook. That's Sophia with a PH. This episode was produced by the Sophia Society. Music is by Faith in Foxholes, and sound engineering is by Joshua Mudge.